Three daughters disappeared from society in the summer of 1852. Their father, one of the wealthiest men in Georgia, told neighbors they'd fallen ill and needed complete isolation. For 11 months, no one saw them. When a new sheriff arrived in the county and started asking questions, he discovered something that made even hardened lawmen sick to their stomachs. What Edmund Rutland had done to his own daughters in the name of preserving his legacy would become one of the most disturbing cases in Georgia history, a calculated experiment that involved false promises, systematic abuse, and a conspiracy reaching all the way to the state capitol. Before we continue with the story of Edmund Rutland and what really happened behind the locked doors of Clearwater Plantation, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, true stories that history tried to bury, don't get told often enough. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know where my audience is, because every region has its own buried secrets, and your comments help me decide which stories to uncover next. Now, let's step back to where this nightmare truly began. In a hotel ballroom in Atlanta, where ambitious men gathered to discuss the future of Southern agriculture. The seeds of horror are often planted in places that appear entirely respectable. The spring of 1852 brought unseasonable rain to central Georgia, turning red clay roads into rivers of mud and delaying the cotton planting by nearly 3 weeks. For most planters, this meant anxiety and financial calculations stretched across long evenings. For Edmund Rutland, it meant an opportunity to travel to Atlanta for the Southern Agricultural Convention, an annual gathering where plantation owners, agricultural scientists, and businessmen convened to discuss innovations in farming, crop rotation, and labor management. Edmund had built his wealth through calculation rather than inheritance. Unlike many plantation aristocrats who'd received their land and slaves through family lineage, he'd started with a modest cotton operation inherited from a distant uncle and transformed it into one of the most profitable enterprises in Hancock County. By 1852, his plantation, called Clearwater for the spring-fed creek that ran through its eastern boundary, sprawled across nearly 2.0 acres and housed 87 enslaved workers. His cotton fetched premium prices in Savannah. His credit stood unquestioned at every bank between Augusta and Mon, and his name carried weight in the state legislature, where he'd served 2 terms before declining a third to focus on his agricultural pursuits. He was 46 years old that spring, a widower of 3 years. His wife, Anne, had died of consumption in the winter of 1849, leaving him with 3 daughters and no male heir. This absence haunted him with increasing urgency. Under Georgia law, his estate would be divided among his daughters upon his death, likely fragmenting within a generation as they married and their husbands claimed portions. The Rutland name would disappear, absorbed into other families, other lineages. Catherine, his eldest, at 22, had inherited her mother's quiet dignity and love of literature. She spent hours in the plantation's library reading novels that Edmund considered frivolous, but permitted nonetheless. Margaret, 20 years old, possessed her father's sharp mind for numbers and often helped him review plantation accounts, demonstrating an almost masculine aptitude for business that both impressed and troubled him. Elizabeth, barely 18, showed talent for painting and spent long afternoons capturing the Georgia landscape in watercolors, her easels set up near the creek. All 3 had received educations unusual for Southern women: French, mathematics, history, music. Edmund had hired a tutor from Charleston who lived in a cottage on the property and provided daily instruction. In Edmund's mind, this education served a purpose beyond mere accomplishment. He was grooming them for strategic marriages to men who would expand his commercial network, perhaps even consolidate neighboring plantations through alliance, but the convention in Atlanta introduced a concept that shifted Edmund's thinking entirely. The Grand Hotel's ballroom glittered with chandeliers on the evening of April 23, 1852. Nearly 200 men in black suits filled the space, their conversations creating a low rumble punctuated by the clink of whiskey glasses and the occasional burst of laughter. Edmund stood near the refreshment table, half listening to a conversation about new cotton gins, when a voice from the speaker's podium cut through the noise. "Gentlemen, if I may have your attention, our next speaker comes to us from the College of Charleston, where he has studied the emerging science of heredity and its applications to agricultural breeding." The speaker was Dr. Nathaniel Petton, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an enthusiasm that bordered on mania. For 40 minutes, he lectured on concepts he'd learned from European scientists. Ideas about bloodlines, inherited traits, selective breeding. He spoke of cattle and horses, of how careful pairing produced stronger offspring, better workers, more efficient animals. The principles that govern livestock, Dr. Petton declared, his voice rising with conviction, apply equally to all of God's creatures. Strength breeds strength. Intelligence breeds intelligence. A farmer who understands these principles can, within a single generation, revolutionize his operation. Edmund listened with growing intensity. Around him, some men nodded thoughtfully while others shifted uncomfortably. The implications hovered unspoken in the air. Everyone in that room understood what all of God's creatures truly meant. After the lecture, Edmund approached Dr. Petton at the bar. They spoke for over an hour, Edmund asking careful questions about hereditary traits, about the science of selection, about documented results. Petton, flattered by the attention and loosened by bourbon, shared more than he might have in sobriety. He spoke of plantation owners in South Carolina who were experimenting with selective pairing of slaves to produce stronger workers. He mentioned a planter near Charleston who had over 15 years created what he called a specialized workforce through careful breeding programs. "The key," Petton said, leaning close with whiskey breath, "is controlling every variable. You cannot leave such matters to chance, to random coupling. You must think like a scientist, like a horse breeder. Identify your finest specimens and create deliberate combinations." Edmund absorbed every word. His mind was already racing, already calculating, but Petton's next statement struck him with particular force. Of course, the ultimate experiment would involve cross-bloodline breeding. Hybrid vigor, some call it, combining distinct lines to capture the best traits of each. Theoretically, it could produce exceptional results. Though such an experiment would require discretion, Edmund understood. The idea was already forming, audacious and terrible. He returned to Clearwater on April 27th, his mind churning with possibilities. The spring rains had finally stopped, and his workers were planting in extended shifts to make up lost time. He rode through the fields on his gray mare, observing the labor with new eyes, assessing each worker not just for their current productivity, but for their potential contribution to a grander design. His attention settled on Samuel. Samuel stood 6'3" and tall, unusually large for any man in that era. He was 31 years old, born on the Ruttled plantation, son of workers Edmund's uncle had purchased in 1819. Unlike many enslaved men who were deliberately kept illiterate, Samuel had somehow learned to read. Edmund suspected from his mother, who had worked in the main house and might have picked up letters from discarded newspapers. Samuel never flaunted this ability, never gave Edmund reason to punish him for it. But Edmund had seen him looking at printed notices posted in the plantation's central yard, his eyes moving across words with clear comprehension. Beyond literacy, Samuel possessed an intelligence that manifested in practical ways. He understood crop rotation instinctively, could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, and had once redesigned the plantation's irrigation system to capture more water from the creek. He worked with steady efficiency, never shirking, but never showing the desperate energy of someone trying to win favor. He was self-contained, dignified in a way that Edmund found both useful and vaguely threatening. Samuel was also unmarried, a deliberate choice Edmund had made years earlier. While most planters encouraged slave marriages to increase their workforce naturally, Edmund had kept Samuel separate, sensing that his value lay in his uniqueness rather than in producing average offspring with average women. Now, riding past the fields where Samuel worked alongside 24 others, Edmund saw him differently. He saw potential. He saw an experiment that could secure the Ruttled legacy for generations. The plan formed over the following weeks. Edmund spent long evenings in his study, the door locked, scratching calculations and notes in a leather journal he kept hidden in his desk's false bottom. He wasn't writing about cotton yields or market prices. He was designing something unprecedented. A systematic breeding program that would bind his daughter's children to the plantation through blood, creating a workforce of mixed-race laborers who could never fully integrate into either white or black society, who would have no choice but to remain at Clearwater. The genius of the plan in Edmund's mind lay in its permanence. These future grandchildren would carry Ruttled blood, but exist outside legal inheritance. They would be bound to the land by biology and law, unable to claim rights as heirs, but impossible to separate from the family enterprise. Edmund would control them absolutely, and they would be genetically engineered for intelligence and strength, combining Samuel's physical power and mental acuity with the Ruttled bloodline. But the plan required more than just forced breeding. It required a framework of justification, a narrative that would protect Edmund from scandal while he pursued his experiment. He needed the cooperation, or at least the silence, of people with power. On May 15th, Edmund invited Judge Horace Ketchum to dinner at Clearwater. Ketchum was 71 years old, a fixture of Hancock County's legal system for 4 decades. He'd overseen property disputes, inheritance cases, criminal trials. He'd also grown wealthy through strategic investments in plantations, including a silent partnership in Edmund's operation. Ketchum had no children, no close family. His loyalty belonged to whoever served his financial interests. They dined on roasted duck and potatoes served by house slaves, who moved silently around the dining room's long mahogany table. Edmund waited until after the meal, until they'd retired to the study with brandy, before introducing his idea. He presented it carefully, framing it as a legal question rather than a moral one. "Judge, I've been studying recent cases involving mixed blood inheritance. Curious legal territory, wouldn't you say?" Ketchum swirled his brandy, his expression neutral. Curious indeed, also quite settled. Mixed blood children have no legal standing to inherit property from white parents. The law is clear. Precisely, Edmund said, which creates an interesting opportunity. If a man were to produce heirs who had no legal claim to his estate, but who were nonetheless bound to it by blood, he could create a permanent workforce that could never leave, never claim ownership, never fragment the property through marriage or sale. Ketchum's eyebrows rose slightly. He was understanding now. "You're speaking theoretically, of course, Edmund replied, "though I wonder if such an arrangement were to exist, would the law protect it? Would the participants be shielded from prosecution or social consequences?" The judge was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the legal implications. Finally, he spoke with measured precision. "Georgia law prohibits miscegenation, sexual relations between whites and Negroes." However, prosecution requires evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, a plaintiff willing to bring charges. If such an arrangement were conducted privately within one's property, with no external complaints, and if certain precautions were taken in how it was documented, then legally speaking, no crime would exist to prosecute. Edmund leaned forward. What precautions? A paper trail suggesting something other than willing participation by the white parties. Documents indicating coercion by the Negro Party. Sworn statements perhaps describing an attack or assault that resulted in unfortunate consequences. Such documentation would protect the reputation of any white women involved and criminalize the Negro should questions ever arise. Edmund's pulse quickened. The judge was outlining a legal framework for his plan. And if the Negro in question were promised freedom in exchange for cooperation, Ketchum's smile was thin and cold. Promises made to slaves carry no legal weight. They can be honored or broken at the master's discretion. A wise man might dangle such promises to secure cooperation, then revoke them once they've served their purpose. The slave would have no recourse whatsoever. They spoke for another hour, Edmund revealing more of his specific plan. Ketchum advising on legal protections and documentation strategies. By the time the judge left Clearwater that night, Edmund had more than advice. He had a co-conspirator, someone with the legal authority to protect the experiment from interference. But Edmund needed more than legal cover. He needed medical documentation, a physician who would certify the health of participants and attest to whatever narrative Edmund constructed. He needed someone who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. Dr. Leonard Strickland had been Clearwater's plantation doctor for 6 years, a man Edmund hired from Augusta after the previous physician died of typhoid. Strickland was 42, competent enough to handle routine medical matters, but unmemorable in every other respect. He was also deeply in debt. Edmund had learned this through discreet inquiries. Gambling losses and poor investments had left him owing substantial sums to several Mon creditors. On May 22nd, Edmund summoned Strickland to the plantation under the pretense of reviewing the health of his enslaved workforce. After examining several workers in the overseer's quarters, Edmund invited him to the main house for lunch. The conversation began with casual discussion of medical matters, recent cases of dysentery, the effectiveness of quinine for fever, common injuries among field workers. Then Edmund steered toward more delicate territory. "Doctor, I have a proposition that may interest you, one that could substantially improve your financial situation." Strickland's expression became guarded. "I'm listening." Edmund explained that he was planning what he called a breeding program to improve his workforce. Carefully selected pairings designed to produce stronger, more intelligent workers. He needed medical documentation throughout health examinations, pregnancy monitoring, birth records. He would pay Strickland $500 per year above his normal fee, a fortune for a rural doctor, in exchange for complete discretion and cooperation. Strickland absorbed this, his discomfort visible but controlled. "You're talking about arranged pairings among your slaves, among others," Edmund said carefully. "The program will include my daughters." The silence that followed was profound. Strickland set down his fork, his face pale. "Mr. Rutteld, what you're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing illegal," Edmund interrupted. "I'm proposing a carefully monitored program to produce healthy offspring who will remain on this plantation permanently. You would document everything exactly as I instruct. In return, your debts would disappear, paid in full by the end of the year. You would continue receiving generous compensation for your services, and you would never speak of any of this to anyone." Strickland's hands trembled slightly. He was trapped. Edmund knew it, and Strickland knew it. The debts were crushing him, and this offer represented not just relief, but survival. "What about your daughters?" Strickland asked quietly. "What do they know of this, that?" Edmund said, is my concern, not yours. Your concern is providing medical care and documentation, nothing more. 3 days later, Strickland sent word that he would accept the arrangement. Edmund now had his legal shield and his medical accomplice. The infrastructure was in place. All that remained was to inform his daughters of their role in his grand experiment. Edmund chose a Sunday evening in early June to gather his daughters in the parlor. Summer had arrived with oppressive heat, and even with windows open, the room felt stifling. Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth sat on the velvet settee, their faces reflecting curiosity mixed with apprehension. Their father rarely called formal family meetings. He stood before the fireplace, though no fire burned in the summer heat. His hands clasped behind his back in a posture they recognized from childhood, the stance he adopted when delivering pronouncements that permitted no argument. I've made decisions regarding the future of this family, he began, decisions that will ensure the Ruttled name and this plantation remain intact for generations. The daughters exchanged glances. Elizabeth, the youngest, folded her hands in her lap, a gesture of nervous anticipation. Edmund continued, his voice steady and authoritative. You are aware that I have no sons, no male heirs to inherit Clearwater. Under current law, when I die, this estate will be divided among you, and through your marriages, it will fragment into other families. Ruttled legacy will disappear within a single generation. Father, Catherine said gently, we understand your concern, but surely there are arrangements. I have found a solution, Edmund interrupted. A way to create heirs who will be permanently bound to this land, who can never claim ownership, but will never be able to leave. A workforce of exceptional quality, combining the best attributes of our bloodline with carefully selected traits from our labor force. The room went very still. Margaret was the first to understand, her face draining of color. Father, what exactly are you proposing? Edmund laid it out with the clinical precision of a business plan. Each daughter would produce children with Samuel, his strongest and most intelligent slave. These children would be raised at Clearwater, educated enough to manage complex work, but kept in a state of legal bondage. They would form the core of a permanent, sophisticated labor force that could never be sold away or lost to marriage. The daughters would be cared for throughout their pregnancies, attended by Dr. Strickland, and afterwards would resume their normal lives. The children would be raised primarily by enslaved nurse maids, with the daughters maintaining whatever level of maternal involvement they chose. This is madness, Catherine whispered. You cannot possibly. I can and I will, Edmund said flatly. You will cooperate with this plan, or you will find yourselves without home, without inheritance, without any means of support. I will write you out of my will entirely, and you will be sent away with nothing. No respectable family will take you in once I make known your disobedience. Elizabeth began to cry, quiet tears streaming down her face. Margaret sat rigid, her jaw clenched. Catherine stared at her father as if seeing him for the first time, recognizing a stranger in familiar features. What about Samuel? Margaret asked, her voice hollow. Does he have any choice in this? Edmund's expression hardened. Samuel is my property. He will do as I command. He will be promised his freedom and land of his own once the children are born and weaned. I suspect that promise will secure his cooperation. You're lying to him, Margaret said. You have no intention of freeing him. Edmund didn't deny it. What I promise a slave is my concern. Your concern is fulfilling your duty to this family. The meeting lasted another hour, with Catherine attempting reason, Margaret making veiled threats to inform authorities, and Elizabeth simply weeping. Edmund countered every objection with cold logic and ultimatums. He had anticipated every argument, prepared every response. He reminded them that they were unmarried women with no independent means, that their reputations would be destroyed if they defied him, that no court in Georgia would side with daughters against a father of his standing. Finally, he delivered his closing statement. You have 1 week to accept this plan willingly. If you refuse, I will declare all 3 of you mentally incompetent and have Judge Ketchum commit you to the state asylum in Milledgeville, where you will spend the remainder of your lives. I have already discussed this option with him, and he has assured me the paperwork can be completed in a single day." With that, he left them in the parlor, their future decided, their agency stripped away. The following morning, Edmund summoned Samuel to his study. Samuel entered wearily as any enslaved person would when called before the master. He stood near the door, his posture respectful but not servile, waiting. Edmund gestured to a chair. "Sit." Samuel sat, confusion evident in his eyes. Slaves were never invited to sit in the master's study. "I have a proposition for you," Edmund began. "One that could secure your freedom and your future." Over the next 30 minutes, Edmund outlined the plan with strategic omissions and calculated lies. He told Samuel that his daughters needed to bear children to secure the family legacy, but that he wanted those children to possess exceptional traits, intelligence, strength, capability. He told Samuel he'd been selected because he was the finest worker on the plantation, a man of clear intelligence and strong character. He told Samuel that in exchange for his participation, he would receive his freedom papers after the children were born, along with 20 acres of farmland near the Tennessee border and $500 to start his new life. Samuel listened in stunned silence. The offer seemed impossible, too generous, but the master's face showed only earnest sincerity. "Why me?" Samuel finally asked. "Because you're exceptional," Edmund replied, "and because I want my grandchildren to be exceptional. You'll be well treated throughout this process. You'll live in better quarters, receive better food, and when it's complete, you'll be a free man with land of your own. Everything documented legally." Samuel's mind raced. Freedom, land, a life beyond bondage. The offer pulled at him with irresistible force, but doubt gnawed at its edges. Why would a man like Edmund Ruttle truly free his most valuable slave? "What about your daughters?" Samuel asked carefully. "They agree to this. They understand their duty to the family," Edmund said, the lie smooth and practiced. "They're willing participants in securing the Ruttled future." Samuel wanted to believe it. The alternative, that Edmund would force such an arrangement, seemed too monstrous even for a slave master, and the promise of freedom blazed so brightly it burned away his more cautious instincts. "If I refuse?" Samuel asked. Edmund's expression darkened. "Then I will sell you to a rice plantation in the coastal lands where you'll work waist-deep in fever-ridden swamps until malaria or exhaustion kills you, which typically takes less than 5 years. The choice wasn't a choice at all." Samuel nodded slowly. "I'll do it." Edmund smiled and produced a document, a contract of sorts, though legally meaningless since slaves couldn't enter contracts, but it detailed the promises Edmund had made. Freedom, land, money. Samuel signed his name in careful, practiced letters. What he couldn't know was that Edmund had already drafted a second set of documents, papers that would declare Samuel a fugitive if he ever tried to leave Clearwater, that would accuse him of assaulting the Ruttled daughters, that would paint him as a violent criminal rather than a cooperating participant. Judge Ketchum had already signed them, post, dated, and ready to be filed if Samuel ever became a problem. The trap was complete, built from lies and legal machinations, ready to snap shut on everyone involved. On June 14, 1852, Dr. Strickland arrived at Clearwater to conduct what he called preliminary health examinations. He met privately with each daughter, examining them with professional detachment while avoiding eye contact. Catherine remained coldly silent throughout. Margaret asked pointed questions about whether he felt any ethical conflict with what was happening, questions he deflected with medical jargon. Elizabeth cried softly during the entire examination. Strickland declared all 3 women healthy and capable of bearing children. He provided Edmund with a written report to that effect, his first document in what would become an extensive medical file. That same week, Samuel was moved from the slave quarters to a small cottage near the main house, a structure previously used for storing tools. It was cleaned, furnished with a bed, a table, and a lamp. He was given new clothes, better food. Other enslaved workers noticed these changes and whispered among themselves, speculating about what special favor Samuel had earned, what role he was playing in the master's plans. The arrangements continued through late June. Edmund met separately with each daughter, assigning them dates. Catherine would go first in early July, followed by Margaret in mid-July and Elizabeth in late July. He described the schedule as if organizing crop rotations, his tone clinical and detached. "You will each spend 3 consecutive nights with Samuel in the cottage," Edmund instructed. "Dr. Strickland will monitor your health throughout. If pregnancy doesn't result from the first attempt, we will repeat the process the following month. This continues until all 3 of you are confirmed pregnant." The daughters received these instructions in horrified silence, their resistance crushed by threats and the overwhelming power their father wielded over every aspect of their lives. On the evening of July 3rd, Catherine was escorted to the cottage by Edmund himself. He knocked on the door and ushered her inside without ceremony. Samuel stood near the window, his face a mask of confusion and discomfort. He had expected something different, not this silent, pale young woman who looked at him with eyes full of despair and resentment. Edmund left them alone, posting an overseer named Virgil Haskell outside the cottage with instructions to remain throughout the night. The message was clear. No one was leaving. No one was escaping. What happened in that cottage over 3 nights isn't something we'll describe in detail. It's enough to say that 2 people were trapped in an impossible situation, forced into intimacy neither wanted, both victims of Edmund's calculated cruelty. Catherine's diary from those days, later destroyed by Edmund, apparently contained only a single repeated phrase, "God forgive us all." By mid-August, all 3 daughters had completed their assigned nights with Samuel. Dr. Strickland visited weekly to conduct examinations. On September 2nd, he confirmed what Edmund had been waiting to hear. All 3 daughters were pregnant. Edmund's reaction was one of satisfied triumph. He immediately isolated his daughters from outside contact, telling neighbors they were suffering from a delicate condition that required bed rest and privacy. The windows of their second-floor bedrooms were fitted with locks on the outside. A nursemaid, an enslaved woman named Penny, who'd been with the family for decades, was assigned to care for them full-time, bringing meals, emptying chamber pots, maintaining basic comfort, while ensuring they never left their rooms unsupervised. Samuel was returned to fieldwork, but kept separate from other workers. His cottage remained his residence, a visible reminder of his special status. Other enslaved people avoided him now, sensing something wrong, but unable to articulate exactly what. He'd become a pariah without understanding why. Edmund spent his days planning for the births, designing nursery spaces, calculating how quickly his enhanced workforce could be expanded. At night, he sat in his study, writing in his hidden journal, documenting every detail of his experiment with the pride of a scientist on the verge of breakthrough. None of them, not Edmund, not his daughters, not Samuel, realized that someone outside Clearwater was beginning to notice irregularities, someone who would soon pose a threat to everything Edmund had built. The summer of 1852 gave way to autumn with its usual transformations. Cotton fields turned white with harvest. Temperatures dropped from unbearable to merely oppressive, and the social calendar of Hancock County resumed after the agricultural pause of late summer. It was during this season of renewal that Sheriff Thomas Brennan arrived in Sparta, the county seat, to assume his new position. Brennan was 34 years old, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, who'd returned to civilian life with both commendations for bravery and a deep disillusionment with authority. He'd served 2 years as a deputy sheriff in Wilmington, North Carolina, before applying for the open position in Hancock County, a position that had unexpectedly opened when the previous sheriff died of a heart attack in July. The county commissioners had hired Brennan specifically because he was an outsider. Hancock County had developed a reputation for lax enforcement of certain laws, for a comfortable arrangement between wealthy planters and local officials that resulted in minimal interference with plantation business. Some commissioners wanted that tradition to continue. Others, including a new faction of merchants and small farmers, wanted actual law enforcement. Brennan represented a compromise, experienced enough to command respect, but unknown enough to potentially shake up entrenched corruption. He arrived in Sparta on September 15th, taking up residence in rooms above the courthouse. His first weeks were spent learning the territory, meeting with deputies he'd inherited from his predecessor, reviewing court records and outstanding warrants. He quickly formed impressions. The county was wealthy but unequal, with a handful of massive plantations controlling most of the land and resources, while smaller farmers struggled at the margins. The previous sheriff had rarely visited the larger plantations, treating them as essentially sovereign territories. Brennan's military background had taught him to observe before acting, to gather intelligence before making moves. So he watched and listened, paying particular attention to which names kept appearing in conversations which men held real power beyond their official titles. Edmund Ruttle's name came up frequently. People spoke of him with a mixture of respect and weariness. Respect for his wealth and influence, weariness about something harder to define. During a conversation at a tavern in late September, a merchant named Hosea Grafton mentioned Ruttledig's daughters in a way that caught Brennan's attention. "Shame about those girls," Grafton said, nursing a beer. "All three took sick at once, I heard. Been locked away in that big house for months now." "What kind of sickness?" Brennan asked casually. Grafton shrugged. "Ruttle claims it's some feminine trouble. Needs privacy and bed rest, but it's strange, don't you think? All three at once, and no one's seen them since June." Brennan filed this information away without comment. It might mean nothing. Illness did strike families collectively, and wealthy planters often kept family matters private. But it registered as worth remembering. His curiosity deepened in early October when he met Dr. Strickland by chance at the courthouse. Strickland was there to file death certificates. 2 slaves from a plantation east of Sparta had died of fever. Routine paperwork requiring official registration. Brennan happened to be reviewing other documents when Strickland approached the clerk. Something in Strickland's demeanor struck Brennan as off, a nervousness that seemed disproportionate to the mundane task at hand. When Strickland left, Brennan asked the clerk about him. "Dr. Strickland, he's physician to several plantations, competent enough, though folks say he has a gambling problem, owes money all over Mon from what I hear." "He seemed troubled to you just now?" Brennan asked. The clerk considered. "Now that you mention it, yes, jumpy, but doctors see a lot of death. Maybe it wears on a man." Brennan let it drop, but the impression lingered. A nervous doctor filing routine paperwork didn't necessarily indicate anything suspicious. But Brennan had learned in the war that small anomalies often pointed to larger problems. The connection between Ruttle and Strickland became apparent in late October, when Brennan happened to be riding past Clearwater and saw Strickland's buggy on the main road, clearly coming from the plantation. On impulse, Brennan followed at a distance. Strickland stopped at a small office in Sparta where Judge Ketchum maintained a private practice separate from his courtroom duties. The doctor went inside and remained for nearly an hour. Brennan waited across the street, pretending to examine his horse's shoes. When Strickland emerged, he looked even more agitated than before, mopping his face with a handkerchief despite the cool October air. Judge Ketchum stood in the doorway, watching Strickland leave with an expression, and Brennan couldn't quite read something between satisfaction and warning. Now Brennan had 3 connected pieces. Ruttle's daughters in mysterious isolation, a nervous doctor making regular visits to the plantation, and a judge meeting privately with that doctor. Separately, each could be innocent. Together, they formed a pattern that troubled him. He began asking questions carefully and indirectly. He spoke with merchants who supplied clear water, with farmers whose land bordered Ruddled property, with anyone who might have recent knowledge of the plantation. What he learned was contradictory and confusing. Some people described Ruddled as a model planter, firm but fair, successful but not ostentatious. Others hinted at darker rumors, slaves who tried to run away and were never heard from again. Punishments that went beyond the brutal norm, a coldness in Ruddled that bordered on cruelty. Regarding the daughters, reports were consistent. They hadn't been seen in public since early June. Church attendance, social calls, trips to Sparta for shopping, all had ceased abruptly. Ruddled's explanation of illness was accepted by most, but a few voices expressed skepticism. Those girls were healthy as horses in the spring. One elderly woman told Brennan after Sunday services, "I saw Catherine at Easter. She was perfectly well. Then suddenly all three need bed rest for months. Doesn't sit right." Brennan decided he needed to visit Clearwater directly. He manufactured a pretext, a routine inquiry about a wanted fugitive supposedly seen in the area. On November 3rd, he rode to the plantation. The approach to Clearwater was impressive. A long avenue lined with oaks leading to a 2-story plantation house of whitewashed brick with columns and broad verandas. Fields stretched in all directions, most harvested now, with workers burning stubble in controlled fires that sent columns of smoke into the gray autumn sky. An overseer met Brennan at the entrance, a man named Thaddeus Porter, who introduced himself with neither warmth nor hostility. "Sheriff Brennan, what brings you to Clearwater?" Brennan explained his manufactured reason, describing a fictional runaway slave from a neighboring county. Porter listened without expression, then shook his head. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description. We run a tight operation here. Mr. Ruddle doesn't tolerate runaways or fugitives on his land. I'd like to speak with Mr. Ruddle directly if he's available." Porter hesitated fractionally. "Mr. Ruddle is occupied with family matters. I can relay any official questions." "Family matters?" Brennan asked innocently. "Nothing serious, I hope." "His daughters are unwell, requires his attention." "I'm sorry to hear that," Brennan said. "Perhaps I could pay my respects. Offer any assistance the family might need." "That won't be necessary," Porter replied firmly. "Mr. Ruddle values his family's privacy during this difficult time." Brennan nodded, but his instincts were screaming now. The overseer's defensiveness, the careful blocking of access to the house, the vague references to illness, it all felt rehearsed, protective. He thanked Porter and rode away, but not far. He circled back through the woods bordering Clearwater's eastern boundary, where the creek ran from a concealed position in the trees. He watched the plantation for over an hour. He saw field workers moving between buildings, smoke rising from the kitchen house, normal rhythms of plantation life. But he also noticed something odd. A small cottage near the main house, separate from the slave quarters, with a man standing outside, not working, just standing, watching. The man was positioned like a guard. Brennan returned to Sparta with more questions than answers. That evening, he did something unusual for a sheriff. He visited the county records office after hours, letting himself in with keys he'd been given as part of his position. He spent 3 hours by lamplight reviewing property records, court documents, anything related to Edmund Ruddle. What he found was a portrait of methodical acquisition and legal maneuvering. Ruddle had absorbed 3 smaller neighboring farms over the past decade, always through foreclosures. He'd apparently engineered by extending credit, then calling in debts. He'd been involved in several lawsuits, all resolved in his favor, often with Judge Ketchum presiding. There were records of slave purchases, cotton sales, tax payments, all meticulously documented. Then Brennan found something that made him pause. A property transfer dated September 10th, 1852, registered but not yet executed. It transferred 20 acres of land near the Tennessee border from Rutledge to Samuel Freedman. The document was signed by Rutledge and witnessed by Judge Ketchum, but marked conditional upon fulfillment of terms to be determined. A promise of land to a slave. That was unusual enough, but the timing. September, just after the daughter's isolation began, suggested connection. Brennan's mind raced. What terms? What had this Samuel done or agreed to do? He found no other references to Samuel in the records, no bill of sale showing when Rutledge acquired him, which suggested he'd been born on the plantation. Brennan made careful notes and returned the documents to their files. Over the next 2 weeks, Brennan quietly investigated Judge Ketchum. He learned the judge was wealthy beyond his judicial salary, with investments in multiple plantations, including Clearwater. He learned Ketchum had a reputation for ruling in favor of planters in virtually every dispute involving slaves or labor. He learned that Ketchum and Rutledge dined together regularly, that their relationship went beyond professional courtesy into genuine partnership. On November 20th, Brennan received information that crystallized his suspicions. A farmer named Amos Pewitt came to his office, hat in hand, clearly nervous. "Sheriff, I don't know if this matters, but I think something wrong's happening at Clearwater." Brennan invited him to sit. "Tell me what you've seen." Pewitt explained that his farm bordered Clearwater's northern edge. In late October, he'd been hunting deer in the woods near the property line when he heard screaming, a woman's voice coming from the direction of the main house. Not a scream of fear exactly, but of pain or anguish. It had lasted only a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. "I thought about going to check," Pewitt said. "But Rutledge doesn't take kindly to trespassing, and I figured, well, it might have been a slave being punished. That's his business, not mine." "But you don't think it was a slave?" Brennan said. Pewitt shook his head slowly. "That scream didn't sound like any Negro woman I've ever heard. It sounded educated, refined, like one of them Rutledge girls." Brennan felt cold certainty settle over him. Something was very wrong at Clearwater, something involving those isolated daughters. But what? And how could he investigate without proof, without jurisdiction, to simply raid a prominent citizen's home? He needed more information, preferably from someone inside the plantation. That meant finding a slave willing to talk, a dangerous proposition in Georgia, where slaves faced brutal punishment for speaking against their masters, and where sheriffs were often more loyal to planters than to justice. Brennan began frequenting the market in Sparta on Saturdays, when some plantations allowed slaves to sell small goods or produce from personal gardens. He watched for anyone from Clearwater, hoping for a chance to speak privately with someone who might know what was happening. On December 7th, his patience paid off. He saw an older black woman selling eggs and overheard another customer mention she was from Clearwater. Brennan waited until she was alone, then approached with careful casualness. "Those eggs look fresh," he said. "I'll take a dozen." As she counted them into his basket, he spoke quietly, not looking at her directly. "I'm Sheriff Brennan. I'm concerned about the Rutledge daughters. Are they truly ill?" The woman's hands froze for just a moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Can't say, sir. Don't see them much, but you've seen them. They're alive." A pause. Then almost imperceptibly she nodded. "Are they being hurt, held against their will?" The woman finished counting eggs, her face expressionless. But as she handed him the basket, she leaned close for just a second and whispered 3 words. "Samuel's Cottage Nights." Then she moved away quickly, calling out her prices to other customers, leaving Brennan standing with his eggs and a phrase that meant everything and nothing. December brought cold rain and the growing reality of 3 pregnant women confined to their rooms at Clearwater. Dr. Strickland made weekly visits, documenting each pregnancy's progress with clinical detachment that barely masked his moral discomfort. All 3 women were healthy, pregnancies advancing normally, expected deliveries in late March or early April. Edmund's satisfaction grew with each positive report. He spent hours planning the nursery arrangements, interviewing enslaved women to serve as wet nurses, designing an education program for the children that would begin at age 4. In his mind, the experiment was succeeding perfectly. Samuel, however, was unraveling. The promise of freedom that had sustained him through the summer now felt increasingly hollow. He'd been moved back to regular fieldwork in September, but remained isolated from other slaves. Housed in his cottage, neither trusted by the enslaved community nor accepted by the white overseers, he existed in a liminal space, waiting for a promised liberation that seemed to recede further with each passing week. In mid-December, he made a mistake born of desperation. He approached Edmund directly while the master was inspecting the cotton storage barns, asking when his freedom papers would be prepared. Edmund's face darkened. The agreement specified after the children are born and weaned. That means at least a year after birth, you'll receive your freedom in 1854, not before. But the paper you showed me said, the paper said upon completion of terms. Edmund interrupted coldly, I determine when terms are complete. You would be wise to remember your position here, Samuel. You're still my property, and you'll remain so until I decide otherwise. Samuel felt the trap closing around him. The promise had been vague intentionally, designed to extract his cooperation without binding Edmund to any timeline. He could delay freedom indefinitely, always finding new conditions, new requirements. That night, Samuel sat in his cottage, considering escape. He could run. Slaves did it regularly, though few succeeded. The north was hundreds of miles away. Patrollers watched every road, and a man his size would be noticed immediately. But staying meant watching. Edmund's lies compound meant remaining enslaved while his children grew up as property. He was still weighing these impossible choices when he heard a quiet knock on his door. He opened it to find Sheriff Brennan standing in the darkness alone, his badge concealed under his coat. We need to talk, Brennan said quietly, and we don't have much time. Samuel's first instinct was fear. Had Edmund sent the sheriff to arrest him for some manufactured crime? But something in Brennan's posture suggested otherwise. This wasn't an official visit. About what? Samuel asked wearily. About what's happening in that house, about those daughters, about whatever arrangement Edmund Ruddle forced on all of you. Samuel's heart raced. How much did this white sheriff know? How much could be safely said? Speaking against your master to authorities typically meant severe punishment or death. But Samuel saw something in Brennan's eyes. Not the usual cold appraisal of a white lawman, but genuine concern. I can't, Samuel began. I know you're in danger. Brennan interrupted. I know Ruddle promised you freedom, and I know he's lying. I've seen the land transfer document. It's conditional, which means he can revoke it any time. You'll never be free unless someone intervenes. Samuel was silent, torn between hope and suspicion. Brennan continued urgently. I need to know what happened. I need evidence. If Ruddle forced those women into whatever is happening here, that's illegal, even by Georgia law. If I can prove it, I can stop him. But I need your testimony, my testimony. Samuel's laugh was bitter. I'm a slave. My word means nothing in any court. It means something to me, Brennan said, and if I can get corroboration from the daughters themselves, from others, then together it might be enough. But I need to know the truth first. Samuel looked at this white sheriff who was risking his position, possibly his life, to investigate a prominent planter. It seemed impossible, too good to be true. But what choice did he have? Stay silent and remain enslaved forever, or speak and barely possibly find justice? He made his decision. Over the next hour, speaking in whispers in the cottage's darkness, Samuel told Brennan everything. The convention in Atlanta and Edmund's obsession with heredity, the false promises of freedom, the forced arrangements with the daughters, the involvement of Judge Ketchum and Dr. Strickland, the isolation of the women, all of it. Brennan listened with growing horror. This wasn't just abuse of slaves, though that alone would have disturbed him. This was systematic violation of Edmund's own daughter's documented conspiracy involving officers of the court, elaborate legal frameworks designed to hide monstrous acts. "I need to speak with the daughters," Brennan said when Samuel finished. "I need to hear from them directly." "They're locked in their rooms," Samuel said. "Edmund controls everything. The only people who see them are the nursemaid Penny and Doctor Strickland." "Then I need to speak with Penny. She's terrified of Edmund. She won't talk to you." Brennan considered. "What about Strickland? He's the weak link. He's being paid to keep quiet, but he's not law enforcement. He doesn't have Ketchum's protection. If I pressure him, he might break." They talked until nearly midnight, developing a plan. It was risky for both of them. If Edmund discovered Brennan's investigation, he could use his political connections to have the sheriff removed from office. If Edmund discovered Samuel's cooperation, punishment would be swift and brutal. But both men had reached the same conclusion. Doing nothing guaranteed continued horror. Brennan left the cottage just before dawn, moving through the woods rather than taking the main road. He returned to Sparta and spent the day preparing. He needed leverage over Strickland, something to force the doctor's cooperation. The answer came through financial records. Brennan visited 3 banks claiming official investigation into unrelated matters and learned that Strickland's debts had indeed been paid off in September. Substantial sums cleared all at once. The payments had come from an account linked to Edmund Rutland. That proved financial connection between Rutland and Strickland, though not necessarily criminality, but it was a starting point. On December 22nd, Brennan rode to Strickland's home in Augusta, arriving unannounced in the evening. Strickland answered the door himself, his face going pale when he saw the sheriff's badge. "Dr. Strickland, I need to speak with you about your medical work at Clearwater Plantation." "That's confidential." "Patient privacy." "Patient privacy doesn't protect criminal conspiracy," Brennan interrupted. "And I have evidence that you're being paid by Edmund Rutland to document activities that violate Georgia law." Strickland's face went from pale to ashen. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. I think Edmund Rutland paid off your gambling debts in exchange for your silence about what he's done to his daughters. I think you've been documenting forced pregnancies while pretending they're voluntary, and I think you're terrified of what happens when this becomes public." They stood in the doorway, cold December wind swirling around them. Strickland's hands trembled. "If you cooperate with my investigation," Brennan said quietly, "I can offer you protection. If you don't, you'll face prosecution as an accomplice when this comes out. And it will come out, Doctor. I promise you that." Strickland's resistance crumbled. "Come inside. We shouldn't talk here, Doctor." Strickland's confession took 3 hours and filled a dozen pages in Brennan's notebook. He described Edmund's initial approach in May, the promises of payment, the examination of the daughters who were clearly unwilling participants. He detailed the monthly visits throughout the pregnancies, the medical documentation he'd falsified to make everything appear consensual. He admitted his role in creating a paper trail that would protect Edmund from prosecution. "He showed me legal documents," Strickland said, his voice hollow. "Papers that would accuse Samuel of assault if questions ever arose. Judge Ketchum had already signed them. The whole thing was designed to be inescapable. If the daughters ever spoke out, Edmund could claim they were lying to protect their attacker. If Samuel tried to leave, he'd be hunted as a fugitive and rapist. It was perfect, horrible but perfect. "Do you have copies of these documents?" Brennan asked. "No. Edmund keeps everything locked in his study, but I've seen them." Sworn affidavit from the daughters signed claiming Samuel attacked them. "Medical reports I supposedly wrote describing injuries consistent with assault, injuries that never existed. Everything needed to reverse the narrative if necessary." Brennan felt sick. Edmund had built a legal fortress around his crime, making prosecution nearly impossible. "What about Judge Ketchum? What's his exact role?" He advised Edmund on the legal framework. "He'll sign any document Edmund needs, and he's prepared to commit the daughters to the asylum if they ever try to testify against their father. He told me that directly, said it was the safeguard in case they became troublesome." This was worse than Brennan had imagined. A sitting judge actively conspiring to imprison potential witnesses to prevent testimony. "I need you to write down everything you just told me," Brennan said. "Sign it and have it notarized. That statement becomes evidence. Edmund will kill me," Strickland whispered, "or have me killed. You don't understand the power he has." "I understand perfectly," Brennan replied, "which is why we need to move quickly. Once I have your statement, I'm going to the state attorney general in Milledgeville. This goes beyond county jurisdiction now. We need state intervention." Strickland spent the rest of the night writing his confession. By morning, Brennan had a signed, notarized document from a licensed physician admitting to conspiracy and detailing Edmund's entire plan. It wasn't enough to convict Edmund on its own. They still needed testimony from the daughters and corroboration from Samuel, but it was a start. Brennan rode hard to Milledgeville, reaching the capital on Christmas Eve. The Attorney General's office was closed for the holiday, but Brennan tracked down the Attorney General himself, a man named Harrison Vance, at his home. Vance was initially irritated by the interruption, but as he read Strickland's confession, his expression shifted to shock. "This is extraordinary," Vance said. "If true, this represents criminal conspiracy involving multiple officers of the court. Judge Ketchum alone. My God, a sitting judge conspiring to commit false imprisonment. I have testimony from the slave Samuel confirming everything," Brennan said, "and I believe the daughters will testify once. They are protected from their father, but I need authority to remove them from that plantation and arrest Edmund Rutland before he discovers the investigation." Vance read through the document again, his legal mind assessing evidence and jurisdiction. "This is complicated. The victims are white women, which normally would make prosecution straightforward, but they're unmarried daughters under their father's legal authority. Some would argue he has the right to arrange their marriages or breeding as he sees fit, particularly if he claims they consented. They didn't consent," Brennan said flatly. "They were threatened with the asylum if they refused. I believe you, but proving it requires their testimony, and if Ketchum can have them declared incompetent before they testify, we lose our case. We need to move simultaneously, secure the women, arrest Rutland, and detain Ketchum all at once. If any of them has warning, they can destroy evidence or silence witnesses." They spent the next 2 days planning. Vance drafted arrest warrants and protective custody orders. He recruited 3 state marshals to assist Brennan. They prepared legal documents removing Judge Ketchum temporarily from his position pending investigation. Everything was coordinated to happen simultaneously on December 27th, but someone had noticed Brennan's investigation. Someone was watching. On December 26th, Edmund Rutland received a visitor, a clerk from the Attorney General's office, a man named Wallace Dunor, who supplemented his meager government salary by selling information to interested parties. Dunor had seen the warrants being prepared, had read Strickland's confession when it was filed, and immediately recognized an opportunity. He rode to Clearwater and was ushered into Edmund's study, where he laid out everything he'd learned. Brennan's investigation, Strickland's betrayal, the planned arrests scheduled for the next day. Edmund's face remained calm, but his mind raced with murderous calculation. He paid Dunor $200 for the information and dismissed him. Then he summoned Virgil Haskell, his most loyal overseer. "We have a problem that needs solving," Edmund said quietly. By morning, Sheriff Brennan left Milledgeville before dawn on December 27th, accompanied by 3 state marshals. They planned to reach Clearwater by mid-morning, serve the warrants, and have Edmund Rutland in custody by afternoon. Brennan felt cautious optimism. They had evidence, they had authority, they had surprise on their side. They lost surprise 10 miles outside Sparta. A tree had been felled across the road, blocking passage. As the riders slowed, gunfire erupted from the woods on both sides. One marshal went down immediately, shot through the chest. Another's horse panicked and threw him. Brennan drew his revolver and returned fire, but the ambush was too well prepared. Within seconds, all 4 lawmen were pinned down behind their fallen horses, taking cover as bullets tore through the morning air. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, 2 marshals were dead, 1 was badly wounded, and Brennan had taken a bullet through his left shoulder. The attackers, at least 6 men, all masked, melted into the woods without ever being clearly seen. Brennan knew immediately this was Edmund's work. Somehow he'd been warned, which meant everything was compromised. The arrest, the protection of the daughters, all of it. He managed to get the wounded marshal onto a horse and limp into Sparta, leaving the dead where they'd fallen. He went straight to the doctor's office where his shoulder was bandaged and the other marshal was declared beyond saving. The man died that afternoon. By evening, when Brennan finally had his wits about him enough to think clearly, he realized Edmund would be destroying evidence and preparing his defenses. The daughters were in immediate danger. If Edmund decided they were threats, he could kill them and claim they died in childbirth. Samuel was in even worse danger. He could be killed and his body hidden, eliminating the key witness. Despite his injury, despite having no official backup, Brennan knew he had to act immediately. He recruited 4 armed men from Sparta, farmers and merchants who'd heard about the attack and were outraged that a sheriff had been ambushed on public roads. They weren't trained law enforcement, but they were angry and armed, which would have to be enough. At sunset, they rode for clear water. Meanwhile, Edmund was implementing his contingency plan. He'd known from the moment Dunor warned him that the situation was unsalvageable. The investigation would continue regardless of ambush. He couldn't stop it, but he could control the narrative. He summoned Judge Ketchum to the plantation. The judge arrived within an hour and the 2 men met in Edmund's study. "We need to execute the insurance," Edmund said. "The papers declaring the girls incompetent. File them tonight." Tonight. Ketchum looked uncertain. "Edmund, there's been an attack on state marshals. If we file anything right now, it'll look like a father protecting his daughters from further trauma." Edmund interrupted. "They were violated by a slave. That slave is about to be arrested and executed. In their delicate mental state, they cannot be subjected to interrogation or testimony. We're protecting them." "That's the story." "And Samuel?" Edmund's smile was cold. "Samuel tried to escape. He was shot while fleeing. His body will be found in the woods tomorrow morning." Ketchum went very pale. "You're going to murder him." "I'm going to eliminate a problem. Are you with me or against me, Horace? Because if you're against me, you're exposed too. Strickland's confession implicates you directly. The judge was trapped and he knew it." "What do you need from me?" "Sign the incompetence declarations. File them with the court clerk tonight. I'll pay him to backdate them to last week before Brennan's investigation officially started. Then go home and wait. When this is over, you and I will be fine. Our story is airtight." Ketchum nodded reluctantly and left with the documents. Edmund then went to find Virgil Haskell, get Samuel, bring him to the creek, to the deep bend past the eastern field. Make it look like he was trying to cross and drown. Hold him under if you have to, but make sure he's dead. I want his body found, but not immediately. Give it 2 or 3 days." Haskell, who'd been following Edmund's orders for 15 years and had long since stopped questioning them, simply nodded. An hour later, as full darkness fell, Haskell and 2 other men went to Samuel's cottage. They told him Edmund wanted to see him urgently. Samuel, sensing something wrong, but having no choice, went with them. They walked toward the eastern fields, ostensibly heading to the main house. But at the creek, Haskell suddenly grabbed Samuel from behind. The other 2 men moved in. Samuel was strong, but 3 against 1 left him little chance. They wrestled him toward the water. Samuel fought desperately, understanding that this was execution, not arrest. He managed to break free briefly and ran, but one of the men tackled him at the creek's edge. They dragged him into the water, pushing his head under. The creek was icy in December, and the current was strong. Samuel thrashed and fought, his lungs burning, darkness closing in. He thought of the freedom he'd been promised, the lie that had led him here. He thought of the 3 women in that house, pregnant with children who would be born into slavery because of Edmund's monstrous experiment. Then, just as consciousness was fading, he heard a gunshot. Haskell released him suddenly. Samuel's head broke the surface, and he gasped air, coughing and choking. There were more gunshots and shouting. Through blurred vision, he saw figures on horseback. Sheriff Brennan and 4 armed men, their weapons drawn. One of Edmund's overseers was down, shot in the leg. The other had his hands raised in surrender. Haskell was running toward the woods, but one of Brennan's men fired, and Haskell collapsed, clutching his side. Brennan dismounted awkwardly, his left arm in a sling, and waded into the creek to pull Samuel out. "Are you all right?" Samuel couldn't speak, could only nod as he lay gasping on the bank. "We're ending this," Brennan said. "Tonight." They left 2 men to guard the captured overseers and rode for the main house. Edmund saw them coming and barred the front door, but Brennan's men broke it open with axes. They found Edmund in his study, calmly sitting at his desk as if entertaining expected guests. "Sheriff Brennan," Edmund said coolly, "this is an illegal entry. I'll have you removed from office. You're under arrest for conspiracy, for attempted murder, and for false imprisonment of your daughters." Brennan replied, "Where are they?" "My daughters are ill and cannot be disturbed. Judge Ketchum has signed orders declaring them incompetent to testify. Any attempt to question them is legally prohibited." "Those orders are void," Brennan said, though he wasn't certain that was true. "Where are they?" Edmund smiled. "I won't tell you, and you can't search my home without cause. Georgia law is very clear on property rights." Samuel, still dripping from the creek, stepped forward. "Second floor, eastern wing, 3 rooms in a row, all locked from outside." Edmund's smile vanished. "You have no authority here, slave." "He's my witness," Brennan said, "and you're under arrest." 2 men stayed to restrain Edmund while Brennan and Samuel climbed the stairs. They found the 3 doors, each with a heavy bolt on the outside. Brennan opened them one by one. Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth Ruddle sat in their respective rooms, all heavily pregnant, all staring at the sudden intrusion with a mixture of hope and terror. Catherine spoke first, her voice arrow from months of little use. "Are you here to help us?" "Yes," Brennan said. "I'm Sheriff Thomas Brennan." "You're safe now." "Your father is under arrest." All 3 women began crying, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief after 7 months of captivity. The trial of Edmund Ruddle began on February 14, 1853, in the Georgia State Court in Milledgeville. The venue had been moved from Hancock County due to concerns about local bias and Judge Ketchum's influence. Ketchum himself had been suspended from his position and faced separate charges of conspiracy and judicial corruption. The prosecution presented Strickland's confession, Samuel's testimony, and most devastatingly detailed statements from Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth Ruddle describing their father's threats, their forced isolation, and the systematic nature of his plan. The defense argued that Edmund had been trying to preserve his family legacy through unconventional but not illegal means, that his daughters had initially consented before later regretting their choices, and that Samuel was a willing participant who had accepted freedom in exchange for cooperation. The trial lasted 9 days. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed Edmund as a monster who'd violated his own daughters, others as a desperate father trying to preserve his heritage in an imperfect world. The fact that his victims were white women made prosecution possible. Had he done the same thing with enslaved women, no trial would have occurred at all. On February 23rd, the jury returned guilty verdicts on charges of false imprisonment